Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Mind Well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Natalie Brooks and I am a licensed psychotherapist. And today I'm launching a new series called the Curiosity in Relationship series. And I know that might sound like a kind of a funny title, but today we're going to dive into something essential, and hopefully it will answer why I have titled it this. And we're going to talk today about what is essential to our relationships and how we connect, how we communicate, and basically how we understand one another. And there's one key factor that will either make or break communication in our relationships. And it's called, it's going to sound really technical and extremely complicated, but I promise you it's not. It's called mentalizing. And so what is mentalizing? Now, mentalizing, let me just back up and say it's not a new idea. It's something that's actually been around for a very long time. I think the word mentalization was, I think, first used in around the late 1800s. However, not in the way that I am using it today. The way I'm using it today comes from a mentalization-based therapy, and that is a therapy that was created by Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman in the United Kingdom. And they discovered that mentalizing is a critical component to interpersonal relationships and how we relate both to ourselves and to other people. And so, what is it exactly? Mentalizing is a form of imaginative mental activity about others or oneself, namely perceiving and interpreting human behavior in terms of intentional mental states. Now that might sound like a bunch of gobbledygook, right? But it's actually quite simple. Mentalizing is the ability to see beyond another person's actions and to try to imagine what they might be thinking or how they might be feeling. In other words, what's going on for them. And it's also our own ability to read our own thoughts and beliefs, wishes and feelings and needs, right? So also within ourselves. So mentalizing is about being able to understand in both ourselves and in the other person one's beliefs, wishes, feelings, needs, goals, thoughts, purposes, and reasons, right? Let me just say, mentalizing is not about mind reading, okay? It sounds, again, mentalizing is it sounds complicated, right? But it's not about mind reading. But what it's about staying curious. So about staying curious about what's in our own minds and why we might be reacting in a certain way. But it's also being curious about why someone else might be responding or acting in a particular way. And so one of the ways that we can decide, or I shouldn't say decide, but one of the ways we can promote a curiosity, right, is rather than asking ourselves why questions or another person why questions, would be to ask, ourselves or the other person what questions. In other words, gee, I wonder what's going on for that person today that they responded to me in such a way, right? And fill in the blank, right? It could be, wonder what's going on for that person today that they responded to me in such a snarky way, or the opposite. Why were they being so friendly to me, right? So being curious without jumping immediately to certainty about knowing why they were acting or not acting a particular way. And the same with ourselves, right? So it's also about asking ourselves similar questions. what is it that just happened that made me react that way? What's going on for me today that I seem to be, super bubbly or super irritable? Okay, so we want to be curious about what's in someone else's mind, but also our own. So, mentalizing is the ability to see beyond the actions and imagine, like I said, what someone else might be thinking or feeling. And it's kind of like an analogy might be to think about if you've ever played chess, or where you're trying to figure out or predict what your next move is going to be, and or your opponent's next move is going to be, right? You're thinking about it. You're thinking about your move. You're thinking about their move. There's a back and forth. And so it's a little bit like that. And mentalizing is fundamental. It's essential to navigating the social world because it's central to effective communication. It helps us build awareness, social awareness, so we can essentially read the room. It supports emotional regulation. In other words, it helps us when, if we're feeling overwhelmed by something, if we can pause and slow down and think about it, that might help us calm down a little bit. And it assists us in problem solving, and it helps us take in new information. So we use mentalizing in just about every kind of relationship. So whether it's with our partners, our families, our friends, teachers, professors, coworkers, bosses, managers, colleagues, coaches, if you play a sport, pretty much anywhere where there's some type of human interaction, communication. And so we also use it in all kinds of places, right? We don't even really think about it most of the time, but we use it in daily life. For example, when we go to the grocery store or a restaurant, at school, work, as I said before, in our hobbies, when we're learning something, sports, and even public transportation, right? If you live in a place that you rely on public transportation, you're interacting with people, even if you don't want to, you're interacting with them all the time. So it's pretty much everywhere we go, and anywhere where there is some kind of interpersonal communication. But what happens when that communication or any communication starts to break down? So we usually have, when communication breaks down, we usually, depending on, our mood and our level of stress and our personality, we typically have, a type of emotional response. We might feel frustrated, we might feel worried, disappointed, hurt, and the degree to which we feel those things will depend on a variety of things. It might, our stress levels, what's going on, our mood, how we were feeling before that miscommunication happened, right? So, if it happens and if it happens over and over again, in other words, if we find ourselves constantly reacting in ways, right, that we internalize or blame ourselves for a situation. In other words, some of us internalize it. We might feel guilty, we might feel embarrassed, or full of self-doubt. That would be an example of internalizing. And other people might externalize, right? They might get snarky and respond in a sarcastic tone, or irritable, or even blame the other person. It's your fault that this happened. And this is where you might see people. I think road rage is a just a quick example of externalization, and where mentalizing has completely completely been lost. We can use road rage as an example. In other words, if somebody, I'm driving and someone cuts me off and I become extremely irate and I start chasing them down the road, I'm not I'm reactive, but I'm also not mentalizing in that I'm clearly not thinking about, gee, maybe that car, the reason they cut me off is because they were dodging a cat that was crossing in the middle in front of them and they were trying not to hit it. And so as a result, they changed lanes super fast and cut me off, right? That would be mentalizing. But the road rage response would be, my reactivity to what just happened. So when this happens, enough, and we have a patterned way, a habituate, a habit of the way we respond to these kinds of situations, right? And it happens over and over, it starts to become habituated. We start to respond in similar ways most of the time, right? It's a pattern. But whether we turn it inward or outward, the impact is the same. We start to question ourselves, or we start to question other people. So if we're internalizing or we're externalizing, one thing is for sure, we're either going to be questioning ourselves or we're going to be questioning others, meaning that we start to distrust either ourselves or distrust the world in general. And that's where something called epistemic trust comes in. Now, I know that's epistemic trust is another complicated sounding thing, but really what it refers to, and this is a quote from Peter Fonagy himself, is epistemic trust means our ability to take in new information and knowledge from our fellow human beings and believe that information that we're taking in we believe it to be reliable and we believe it to be trustworthy. So at its core, epistemic trust is the foundation for social learning, because as human beings, it's in our DNA to scan the environment for danger. So when we're learning something new, we have to trust that who and what is being communicated to us is reliable and trustworthy. Many things will affect a person's development of epistemic trust. Traumatic experiences, particularly early developmental trauma, trauma in early relationships, in other words, trauma that has happened from one person to another. So, for example, physical abuse of children by another person. That's the kind of thing that will crush epistemic trust. Because as children look to adults, to their caregivers, to primary caregivers, teachers, coaches, or any adult that they come in contact with regularly, and how those adults respond to them matters. And it matters tremendously. It matters deeply to them. Because if they're responded to in a way that is what we call reflective, which is another word for mentalizing. Sometimes those two words are used interchangeably, reflective and mentalizing. And by reflective, I mean to reflect, to think, or to contemplate, right? So if that's an easier way to think about mentalizing, it's often used interchangeably. But the point is that when the child is reflected, when it's reflected back to the kid, that they matter, that, again, what the child is telling the adult matters to the adult, then the child feels like it matters not only to the adult, but that they matter, right? So that's where epistemic trust starts to build, right? But in trauma, particularly interpersonal trauma inflicted by another person, that can really erode and damage a child's epistemic trust. And in teens, and even, young adults and adults, right? It's our peer group or our friends or our social circle, or if you play a team sport, right? It's teammates. Those people also have an impact and can impact our level of epistemic trust, right? So an example of that might be, a kid in junior high or high school who's being bullied, and that kid reports that they're being bullied to a teacher or to a school administrator. And if it's responded to in a way where the child feels heard and that they matter, again, it's not going to erase the bullying, but they're going to feel that level of trust in the sense that they matter, right? So it's also, to use a different example for someone in, a bit older, it could be in the workplace too. If someone, goes to their superior or to human resources and files, a complaint because they're being sexually harassed and nobody does anything, imagine how that can start to erode at a person's level of trusting that they're safe in their environment, that they can trust that the people that they're reporting to respond in a way that they feel seen and heard, and therefore changes their environment to make them feel safe. So all of these examples are when epistemic trust is harmed. Not only does it become hard to trust, of course, but it also becomes hard and really difficult to learn from other people, to learn new information, to take in new information. And it also makes it hard to connect to other people, and it makes it hard to feel safe. So kind of, in the bullying and the sexual harassment example, if we don't feel like we're taken seriously, and a person already feels unsafe, imagine not being responded to in a way that's just going to make someone else feel more unsafe, right? So then it becomes almost a feeling that they don't matter. And so if epistemic trust has been broken in some way, and this is where therapy comes in, the idea is that we will work with the person to hopefully rebuild that. And how we do that is what research has identified as one of the key factors that can increase, maintain, or repair epistemic trust. And if you haven't guessed it already, that is mentalizing. And so, yes, mentalizing helps build epistemic trust. So when someone mentalizes with us, when they wonder about what we're feeling or what we're thinking, or in the example of the sexual harassment report, the person is taking us seriously and how they can make their environment in the meantime safer. And what that does is it creates a sense of being not alone. In other words, a person will feel alone in their own mind with their traumatic thoughts if they don't feel like someone else is responding to them in a reflective, empathic way. It sends the message that the person is alone with their thoughts, that they're alone with their experience. And that is what breaks down epistemic trust. And it also keeps one from healing from the trauma. So knowing that our mind matters to someone else, that's what helps us grow. That's what helps trust grow again. And where epistemic trust can be repaired, or if it's not broken, right, it can be maintained. But mentalizing is a skill. It's something that we all do every single day. And that doesn't mean we have to be perfect at it. In fact, we're not going to be perfect at it. We're going to get things wrong. But the important part is, are we staying curious about what's in our own minds and the other person? I use the example of physical therapy. So if any of you have ever broken your arm or your leg or been in a cast or not used a particular body part for an extended period of time, right? You have to relearn how to use that arm or that leg. The muscle memory is there, but you have to relearn it. And you have to use it. You have to practice it. And it's the same with mentalizing. We all have the capacity to mentalize, but it is a skill and we have to practice it and we can relearn it. So that's the good news, right? And we can use mentalizing to build better relationships, both on an interpersonal level within our own personal lives, but also out in the world. And so it's not just a me, it's a we and a collective thing, right? Because if I'm doing that wherever I go, I'm not having a reaction based on something that I'm assuming to be the answer, when there are a possibility of numerous other answers is what I'm saying. And that's mentalizing. So whether you're a therapist, a parent, or an executive leader, or just someone who wants to know more about how to connect in interpersonal relationships, mentalizing is going to help us stay curious, which inevitably will help us stay and feel more connected. In my next video, I will be talking about what ineffective and effective mentalizing looks like in both oneself and in another person, and how to spot it, how to identify it when it's happening both in yourself and in someone else. So if you found this video helpful, please be sure and give it a like, and please leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, hit the subscribe button if you want to know more. In the meantime, thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.